'Twas the night before Christmas. Literally, I did not think I was going to get this video out on time. Hello everybody and happy holidays! One of my favorite Christmas movies is the classic Rankin Bass Rudolph movie. I've always loved stop motion animation and this movie captures the Christmas spirit perfectly. So why don't we make some custom Littlest Pet Shops of Rudolph and his lovely gal Clarice. I planned their designs on the app Procreate on my iPad. They'll be based off of the stop motion puppets from the movie with a few additional details to make them more like my take on them. I wanted them to be looking at each other so that when they're sitting on a shelf, they'll look like they're happy together and all cutesy. For the bases, I'll be using these two LPS deer from the Musically Talented Blind Bake series. I've mentioned these in my previous LPS custom video, and these are the only LPS from this series I have a duplicate of, so this was perfect. Alright, let's get started.
Now, get to work!
First off, we want to remove the factory paint. I use 100% acetone, along with makeup pads and Q-tips to wipe the paint off the LPS. So as I was removing the paint off of this deer, I found this thing on its eye. I'm honestly not quite sure what it is, but we'll take care of that later. Looks good. Now onto the other one. Yeah, I should mention, since I'm doing two, that means I have to do two of everything. I'll speed it up for you guys. Off screen, I wash the LPS under warm water to clean all the excess acetone off so it doesn't ruin the plastic over time. Alright, time to address the eye. I honestly have no clue what happened to this deer. It must have been a manufacturing issue or something, but I carefully performed eye surgery and carved the blob off until it was as smooth as I could get it. While I was at it, I gave the deer a full package deal and touched up some of the other seams. I noticed the other deer was suffering from a similar issue on her cheek, but since it wasn't as bad as the other deer, I just sanded it down. Since we have the sandpaper out, I'm going to do a light sanding over both of the deer bases. The plastic used to make LPS is pretty smooth, which can make it hard for the paint and epoxy I'll be using to stick properly. So I wanted to take extra precaution with these customs and roughed up the surfaces with some sandpaper. Now do that one more time and we're all set. Perfect! Alright, time for the lobotomy portion of the video. I'm being serious. I'm gonna put holes in his head. Rudolph's antlers and nose will need some anchors for reinforcement. So I marked where they'll go with pencil and used an awl to slowly carve holes into his head. We're not gonna think too much about this. It's very weird to do. This is horrifying. This is where I found out this LPS mold is not symmetrical. As you can see here, the ears are not aligned in the direction the head is facing, and that's completely fine and it looks great, but this did make things a little difficult as I was not sure if I should align the antlers with the ears or the face, but I ended up going for the face as it'll look better when looking at Rudolph straight on. After Rudolph's successful lobotomy, I took jewelry wire and bent the ends so that they stay in place, cut them to size and gently put them in the holes. It is very important that you do this as gently as possible. I ended up poking through his chin.
Great bouncing iceberg!
I fixed the nose wire and made the antlers base smaller, and now that Rudolph is fitted out with some new piercings, we can move on to my most dreaded part, the epoxy sculpt. Here it is. Don't ask why the lid is cracked. You'll need to mix 50% part A with 50% part B. Also, please wear gloves when using epoxy sculpt. Mixing A and B causes a chemical reaction, which is why this stuff is so strong. But it's also not good for your skin, so please be careful when working with this. We will need to mix this really good. If mixed properly, after it sits for like 24 hours after sculpting, it becomes as hard as a rock and is basically unbreakable. And if not mixed well, you will see. Alright. Now that our little epoxy baby is all mixed, we need to let her sit for a while for better consistency.
Well, time passed slowly.
Starting with Rudy, I shaped his little baby horns and smoothed the epoxy with water as I go to get the best results. These are pretty simple horns, so I'm not doing anything too complicated, but even in saying that, working this small is really difficult. I was careful with the nose as I put it on Rudolph because I wanted to keep its round shape as best as possible while also trying to press it into the already existing nose to the point where it's completely covered and flush with the plastic. After seeing Rudolph with the antlers, I felt like there was a lot of empty space on his forehead, so I changed my mind.
I changed my mind!
So instead of having his forehead naked and afraid, I added some tufts of hair to fill in the space. And I'm really happy with this decision, especially after he's all painted later. Because I wanted the epoxy to look seamless, especially with the fur, I tried my best to blend the clay into the base. What was difficult about this though is that the gray color of the epoxy makes it less clear on whether or not I'm doing a good job at blending. And this is why you'll see people paint over their projects with a gray paint and sand afterwards, because it makes those details a lot more obvious to spot. But unfortunately, we are not doing that here, so I'm just gonna go in blind. In the Rankin Bass designs, and like reindeer in real life, both Clarice and Rudolph have hair on their necks. I included that in my designs as well. I had to be extra careful with the chest fur as I still want the head to bobble and be able to turn, so I blended the fur a bit earlier than where the neck ends to circumvent that. I made the hair in my design a bit more prominent by adding individual tufts with the epoxy sculpt. To achieve this look, I would roll a teeny tiny ball of epoxy, place it in the desired location, and blend one side upwards to give an illusion of fluffiness. Lastly, I put fur right above the hooves. I'm hoping to make a gradient of a lighter color going down their legs and stopping at the hooves to pronounce the hoof fur even more. I actually got pretty frustrated on the legs on both of the deers as there is little to no space when working on this part of the pet shop. I will be keeping this in mind for future projects and ideas, but that is also why there is not nearly enough footage of me working on this part, because I was holding them as close to my face as possible to even comprehend what I was doing. Literally, I looked like a candy cane sitting at my desk. I was so hunched over. I did all the same things for Clarice, excluding the antlers and nose of course, but it was a tad bit easier having already done Rudolph, so I felt more prepared this time. Little did I know, this is where I made a big mistake. Because I didn't want the epoxy to start hardening by the time I worked on Clarice, I mixed her batch separately when I needed it, and I did not mix it properly. I woke up the next day after doing all the sculpting, and when I checked on them, I realized that all of the epoxy on her was still soft and just basically falling off. So all of the work you're currently watching was scrapped and redone off camera. I will be using this as a learning experience, and now I know that it does not hurt to mix the epoxy more than needed because God, I needed it. But the second time went way smoother and was a success. And in my opinion, it looks a lot better too. After finishing up the sculpting, I moved on to sanding all the epoxy elements to assure they'll look as good as possible. Epoxy takes to sanding really great, but while doing this, I used water, preferably from an old Parmesan cheese container, because inhaling epoxy dust is a big no-no. Please always wear respiratory gear or use water to prevent dust from being inhaled. Epoxy is not to be messed with. If I could change one thing about these customs, it would be that I was more thorough with the sanding, as afterwards when I move on to painting, it's a lot more obvious that I missed a few areas from the epoxy. But like I said, it's pretty hard to see it with this gray tone, and I'm still really glad I experimented with using epoxy, and it was really fun. I had a really great time, and I feel like I have more knowledge for my next customs. Who knows, maybe I'll become an epoxy sculpt wizard. Now it's finally time to start painting. I'll be using this paint palette from videos past, which would really be the future for you guys because I haven't uploaded it yet during the time I release this video, which for you guys would be the present technically, unless you're watching this in the future after December when the other video would be released, which would make it the future. In the movie, Rudolph is depicted with a more reddish brown coat, whereas Clarice is a light beige. I decided to keep these colors as I like the way they mismatch and I think it's very cute. Using a brush with very little paint, I lightly brush the deer until I have a shallow coat and put it aside to dry. After it's done drying, I repeat this step a bazillion times until it's fully opaque. This technique is called dry brushing, and the reason why I'm doing this for the base coat is so that it is as smooth as possible. I get pretty nervous when working this small because I'm very clumsy, and I don't even mean that in like a, I'm so clumsy, he's silly. I mean that as in like I will destroy everything I own because I can't help myself. So to reduce the possibilities of ruining these guys, I started super close to the original base color for the details, and then I used lighter paint as I added more coats. Even though I add lighter coats as I go, I still don't want the scleras on either of the deer to be pure white. I tend to avoid pure white in most of my art unless I'm emphasizing something to be extra bright, like reflections or just utilizing light. And I wanted to introduce that part of my art style to my LPS customs. I just really love how it unites all the colors and gives me the opportunity to use pure white in a more intense way. I'm going for a more vintage style with these customs as they're inspired by the vintage movie, of course, and I also have a personal goal to experiment with texture more. My past customs were super simple and used very minimal detail, whereas these ones have the epoxy additions and use more colors, so I feel like now is a good time to go out of my comfort zone. One of the texture details I added was a furry design on both of their foreheads. Using both light and dark variants of their base colors, I tried my best to make it look as natural as possible without making it too blobby, as that would make it look less fur-like. I also think it was needed because the deer mole just has a massive foreheads, which I love, but in my opinion, if I'm going to do more detail everywhere else, it would be pretty noticeable if I didn't have that design. I'll be honest with you guys, I did not like how the fur on her face was looking. It got too blobby and was starting to get kind of out of hand. I kept trying to add light and dark tones to help it, but nothing was working, so I wiped that part away and just started over. After that fiasco, I started on doing the gradients on the legs. I achieved this by dry brushing down the hooves and over the fur. So I went back into doing the facial hair. That sounds weird. I originally had used the smallest brush I had on hand, which to be honest isn't actually small enough for LPS customs, but I had found that my larger brush was actually perfect. I used slightly watered down paint and lightly brushed it across the forehead to get the fur texture that I was looking for. I'm really glad I redid this part as I knew I wasn't going to be satisfied with what I had originally, so I'm pretty happy about that. I had the idea to add white spots to Clarice's back to tie into her polka dot bow she'll be wearing. I actually looked it up and reindeer can have spots and it is super cute. Before we get to the eyes and dark details, let's put Clarice aside to dry while we work on Rudolph. Rudolph is basically the same idea, but in a different font. Like with Clarice, I didn't use pure white in any of Rudolph's details. It's a lot more obvious on him though, because I kept his values pretty dark. His eyes and fur will be painted a sort of mauve color, and I thought about making it a bit lighter, as it's pretty different from Clarice's lighter values, but I'm glad I didn't, as it feels even more like the kind of color palettes you'd see in vintage Christmas art. If you're wondering what kind of paint I use for these customs, it's actually a variety of different acrylic paint brands my mom and I have collected over time. Most brands are fine. As long as it's acrylic paint, you'll be good. I recommend watering the paint down to make it apply smoother. I did the same technique for Rudolph's face as I did with Clarice's, but this time I added some extra to the tips of his ears and eventually his cheeks to give a blush effect. I did these little wisps of fur around the eyes, and it's the cutest thing ever. I love when people do more realistic fur on customs, and I'm honestly amazed by how people are able to make LPS so detailed. I gave Rudolph freckles. I'm not sure why, I kind of just feel like it's right for him to have freckles. And I started painting his iconic red nose. For the nose, I just used straight red paint. I didn't want it to blend into his color palette as it's kind of the point that it stands out. With both of their paint jobs done, we can now move on to the eyes and dark details. I'm so excited because this is where they really come to life. I used a colored pencil to sketch out the eyes because it can get a bit tricky making them as even as possible, especially when they're not looking straight on like what I'm doing here. I looked up images of some of the original LPS deer designs released by Hasbro, and the only one I could find was a deer with sticker eyes, which wasn't gonna work as a proper reference for me. I don't know if I'm missing one or if they just didn't do it, but I kind of had to just freeball it. If you remember my concept art at the start of the video, I didn't actually plan on giving these guys irises because the Rankin Bass characters didn't have them. But I changed my mind yet again and decided Rudolph was going to have green eyes. Now the color you see is actually going to be a lot darker because this was much more vibrant than I was expecting. But the green complements Rudolph's nose perfectly and gets extra points because Christmas. I made Clarice's eyes a brown similar to Rudy's coat. Original LPS always have two colors for their irises, but I tend to stick with just one as I fear I would mess the eyes up trying to do that. I used the irises as a guide for the pupils and tried to make them as even as possible. For the hooves, I made the paint extra wet so that it would seep in between the details of the fur to make the shapes clearer. Now on to the most stressful part of customizing. I used a dark brown for the lash line on the two deers. Starting with Clarice, I wet the brush enough for it to glide around the socket for the smoothest outcome. I did her wing perfect, then went on to immediately mess up the other one. To fix my mistakes, I clean the brush with water I have on hand and gently move the still wet paint until the brush picks it up. I was originally going to glue false lashes to Clarice, but after seeing her with the eyes finished, I couldn't. I think she ended up super cute and I didn't want to go overboard. I'd love to do that with a future custom though, as it's a fun detail, especially when LPS have such big eyes. Rudolph uses the same dark brown for his details so that they match. This brown really complements his more red fur. I'm really proud of how the color schemes turned out on these. His little baby antlers are so cute. I'd love to do a custom with massive antlers now that I've experienced with the epoxy. Being very careful, I did his lash lines. I really didn't want to cover up any of the details around his eyes, same with Clarice, so I did as minimal line work as possible on these two. Using a white watercolor pencil, I drew where I wanted the eye shines to go. Clarice's will be shaped as little hearts, so I tried my best to make them as crisp as possible. I'm trying a dotting tool this time for the circles, but I don't think I mixed enough paint for it to be fully coated, so that gave me some issues. For Rudolph, I made his eye shine circles to match his round nose. This was surprisingly more difficult than the hearts. Using some Mungyo pastels, Using some Mungyo pastels, I brushed a pink blush on Clarice's cheeks, and I put some hot pink pastels on Rudolph's nose to make it look glowy. Although I'm not too sure on how much it shows, but oh well. I used watered down gloss Mod Podge on their eyes, noses, hooves, and antlers. I did a few coats to get them nice and glossy. Off screen, I gave them a coat of satin finish to lock in all of the work I did. Next, I got a fork. Hang in with me. Clarice is still missing her iconic polka dot bow, so I used some ribbon and tied it into a bow using the fork method, which apparently is a lot harder than I thought. I sewed a string through it to prevent it from falling apart and then painted the polka dots. Lastly, I used some fray away on the edges of the ribbon to prevent fraying, and after it dried, I went on to super gluing it to Clarice's head. And that's it. Let's see the final shots. I'm so proud of how these guys turned out. I genuinely was not expecting them to look as good as they do, but I'm so happy with how the colors look. I love how they match together, and I'm just really glad everything seemed to have worked out. I'm so glad to now have these guys in my collection, especially since they're referencing a movie that I love so much, and I really hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I hope you guys all have a lovely holiday, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!
Merry Christmas!